Hello. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. My name is Kelsey Norman, and I'm a fellow for the Middle East and director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees program at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. This webinar is a collaboration between the Center for the Middle East and the Center for the United States and Mexico. And in both these regions, the Middle East and broader Mediterranean on one hand, and the US, Mexico, and Central America region on the other hand, the issue of migration has become so critical and impactful for regional politics, economies, security, and for the lives of individual migrants and refugees more broadly. In 2015, we saw a political crisis unfold as more than 1 million asylum seekers arrived in the European Union. And we're still seeing the political consequences of how Europe reacted, both within the EU and further afield in countries of the Middle East and North Africa region. Immigration was also a touchstone issue in the 2016 US election that brought President Donald Trump to office. After an escalation of migrant arrivals to the US in 2018 and 2019, and a humanitarian emergency at the southern border with Mexico, we saw the Trump administration take unprecedented measures to limit the number of both regular and irregular migrants. This has impacted not only the politics of the US, but also of Mexico and countries of the Northern Triangle. Today, we're hoping to start a conversation about the similarities and differences between these two regions and the migration crises that they face, with a wonderful range of speakers. To introduce these speakers and to moderate this discussion, I'm pleased to introduce Ali Noorani, President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Immigration Forum in Washington, DC. So now I'll hand it over to Ali.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. I really appreciate the opportunity to join everybody today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I want to begin with a big thank you to Rice University and the Center for the Middle East and the Center for the United States and Mexico. Now, it's interesting because we were originally thinking of doing this, we were first talking about this panel back in the spring. And then obviously COVID-19 and all the challenges that have come with COVID-19 led us to this delay. And I should pause here and on behalf of the forum, we want to extend our gratitude to the first responders across the country, immigrant and native born who are caring for the ill, who are getting food to our tables, and really all around the world, the immigrant and the refugee community who are contributing. But because of COVID-19, one of the things that's happened is that we've ended up convening this panel today. And I'm not sure there could be actually a better time for this conversation because we're about 2 weeks out from the election. We were about 2 months away from a new Congress and a new administration. And more than anything, we are potentially on the cusp of a reset and hopefully a recommitment of the United States to the engagement of the world when it comes to global migration. And that challenge, could not be larger. Because with at least 79.5 million people around the world who have been forced to flee their homes, nearly 26 million refugees, around half of whom are under the age of 18, how to manage migration in a safe, a secure, a compassionate fashion will all while recovering from COVID-19, will, I think, be one of the greatest challenges facing a Biden administration in the next 4 years, but really policymakers, whether in the US or around the world in the time to come. Because at least from my perspective and from the forum's perspective, we've come to strongly believe that the way that Americans from Main Street to Capitol Hill come to kind of see domestic immigration policy or shape domestic immigration policy is really based on their perspective or their perception of global migration. So we need to understand how these are linked, these being global migration and domestic immigration policy, how they're linked in terms of policy, politics, and ultimately the public narrative. And this incredible panel that I'm just really honored to moderate today is, I think, an important step in that process of understanding those connections. So let me introduce the speakers, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, and then each speaker will introduce the next, and then we'll come around to questions at the end. So if you do have questions along the way, please put them in the Q&A, and we're going to be going through them and talk, and I'll in the moderated Q&A afterwards, I'll make sure that I bring up the questions you put into the chat box. So Our first speaker is going to be Andrew Seeley. He's the president of the Migration Policy Institute, based here in Washington, D.C., a nonpartisan institution that seeks to improve immigration and integration policies through fact-based research, opportunities for learning and dialogue, and the development of new ideas to address complex policy issues. Our second speaker will be Carmella Gadu. She is the International Organization for Migration's Regional Director for Middle East and North Africa. With 25 years of experience at IOM, Carmella is one of the world's preeminent experts on Middle Eastern and African migration. And I also have to say that she is zooming in, if you will, from Cairo, so we really appreciate her stretching the day long so that she can be with us. And then our final speaker is Matthew Reynolds. He's the regional representative for the U.S. and the Caribbean at the UNHCR. Matthew brings years of experience working on refugee issues for the UN, as well as years of experience, leadership staff experience at the U.S. State Department, the House of Representatives, as well as the United States Senate. So I'm, again, really thankful to Rice University for convening this panel. I'm thrilled to be able to moderate, and I'm really looking forward to hearing our speakers. And again, please do put some questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those afterwards. So, Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ali. It's great to be with you, Ali. First of all, great to be at the Baker Institute and at Rice University. I'm sorry we couldn't be there in person this time. I've had a number of opportunities to join colleagues at the Baker Institute in the past, and great respect for the work they do. And so thanks for having all of us here today. Let me pick up what Ali said. One of the challenges in the world is how we have safe, orderly, and regular migration. The language that's been used in the Global Compact, but it's become sort of generally used by countries around the world. Most migration in the world happens pretty naturally, and it actually happens without us worrying about it a whole lot. It certainly is an upheaval in people's lives, but people move for work, they move for love, they move for studying, they move for many reasons. They move through legal channels. It happens pretty regularly and bureaucratically. And it does not cause a great deal of uproar around the world. And about, so we have a sense of the size. We're talking about 3.7, 3.8% of the world's population lives in a country that of people around the world live in a country they were not born in. So it is a small percentage of people around the world. It stayed relatively constant over time. It has gone up over the past 40 years, but only very gradually. So despite sort of this sense that there's mass migration everywhere, migration patterns have an odd stability to them, actually over time. That said, there are parts of the world where migration patterns are anything but stable, where in fact mass migration takes place, where people move in large numbers, and where there is a mixture of people moving for economic opportunities and people moving because of forced migration or persecution, people who are being pushed out of their homes either because of desperate circumstances or because of violence and insecurity where they live. And two of those areas are the areas we're talking about today, the Mediterranean and Central America. We could certainly talk also about the Venezuelan crisis, the Nicaraguan crisis going on. Venezuelan crisis primarily in South America, but these are two areas of the world where we've seen mass migration primarily through irregular channels, and where our ability to manage migration in safe, orderly, and regular way has really broken down in both cases. And the primary means that we have of dealing with people has been to put them through our asylum systems. That does not work terribly well in both countries with mixed migration flows, where some people clearly deserve asylum, some people are clearly economic migrants, and there's a lot of people in the middle who are leaving circumstances where there is some component of forced migration, of violence and persecution, but there's also other factors there. And our asylum systems are not always good at teasing those out. I'll come back to that in a second. And so what we've seen is sort of a collapse of these systems, and a need to begin to rethink what we do about protection, what we do about people who have primarily economic motives. What about those cases in the middle? And this has happened in Europe, and this has happened in North America as well, primarily in the United States. Secondly, we're in a moment where COVID has changed our patterns of mobility. So migration has a certain amount of constancy towards it. And mobility in general, mobility around the world has gone up enormously, right? The number of people get on airplanes has gone up enormously. The number of people cross border, at border ports has gone up enormously. Migration has only gone up very gradually over time. What's happened in the past year, however, since March, is an enormous immobility around the world, right? Where we've actually stopped moving around the world in the ways that we used to. And migration patterns is one piece of that, right? Where people are not migrating at the same levels that they used to. And in fact, some people become trapped in countries that are not their own, that they do not want to be in. They were trapped temporarily. In some cases, can't get back still today. And lots of people might want to move forward somewhere else, either through legal or through regular channels, find themselves stuck where they are. Legal channels have often shut down. Consulates are closed. Visa offices are closed. There are moratoria on some kinds of visas in some countries around the world, including in the United States, right now for a lot of temporary visas. And you also are seeing a situation in some countries where asylum systems have been largely closed down, either because of the pandemic or because of other measures, such as those taken by the Trump administration at the U.S.-Mexico border before the pandemic, and then with the pandemic, additional measures that were wrapped up as health measures, but essentially ended almost any access to asylum at the border. We need to think differently about the future. We need to think about how we manage and regularize these migration flows in a different way. Enforcement-only approaches don't work. We've tried those. They tend to work for a while and they eventually fail, which doesn't mean we don't need enforcement. Enforcement is going to be part of however countries manage their borders. So we do need professional, humane, transparent, rule of law based enforcement, but we also need other tools in the toolkits. And so let me point out, usually when people make grand statements like we need to rethink, it's followed by some brilliant set of ideas. Unfortunately, I don't have those. In fact, I don't think anyone does. I can tell you some pointers where we should be looking, but we don't have an alternative for all this. But I think we do have some ideas about where we should be looking for those alternatives. So let me point to three of them. First of all, we need to think about how we revise our asylum systems. Asylum systems need to be streamlined so they actually work quicker. In the United States, my colleague Doris Meisner has talked about how you could put asylum officers in charge of making final decisions on asylum rather than sending them to immigration courts, something we do on affirmative asylum, but we don't do at the US-Mexico border. Make it much quicker, probably much more fair and more efficient. And we can think of other ways. My colleague Hannah Behrens has talked about how you do this in Europe as well. You make procedural changes that simply make these systems much more fair, but also more efficient. Because it is not fair to people who are stuck in the asylum system, who have legitimate claims, who have strong claims, to be waiting for years to get a decision. But it's also not healthy that people who are primarily looking for an opportunity to work can use the asylum system as a way of getting temporarily into a country. It's not fair on either side. And so we need to figure out how we fix asylum systems. Secondly, we need to be thinking about labor pathways. A lot of people, though they may have protection needs, to some degree, are primarily motivated by economic needs. And often these are intertwined. Often these are not separable. But sometimes not everyone is clearly going to qualify for asylum. And so thinking about how we create labor pathways for those areas of the world where people are moving in large numbers through irregular pathways is absolutely critical. And I would say in Central America, one of the obvious things that stands out is we only had we actually had less than 10,000 people from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the countries that produce the greatest irregular migration to the US. Those three countries had less than 10,000 seasonal visas last year. Mexico had about 260,000. But the disparity is enormous, and Mexican irregular migration has dropped over the past 10 years. Now it's gone up a little bit, very tiny amount recently, mostly recidivism. But in terms of Central America, creating those labor pathways matter. Creating labor pathways from countries in Africa and the Middle East to Europe matters. So thinking of those labor pathways, looking at the work of Helen Dempster on this, or my colleague Kate Hooper, Helen Dempster at Center for Global Development, is incredibly useful. And then finally, and the last thing I'll point is thinking about migration as part of our recovery strategies. We get back to mobility, thinking that migrants and migration are also part of the assets that we have. Migration is not really a problem to be dealt with or a problem to be fixed. It's actually an asset that we need to manage. And so thinking about how, in the context of recovery, we begin to think about these flows as an asset. And there are several ways we should be doing that. One is thinking about those who are undocumented in our countries as people who are not as productive as they could be, who are not able to invest in their own education and their own productivity long-term. How we bring people out of the shadows matters, because they can be greater contributors to the labor market than they are now. They're almost always contributing to the labor market, but how they can be even more productive in the labor market if they had legal documents, that's a conversation we should be having as an asset conversation. Secondly, thinking about what kinds of workers do we need in the future? That goes back to labor pathways. How do we build those? It also goes to the resettlement discussions for refugees and asylum. How do we make sure that we have the kind of workforce we need in the future? Where does this come in? How do we meet this with labor pathways? But also, how do we meet this with refugee resettlement, for example? Opportunities to bring in hardworking refugees who could really contribute on the labor side. And it also matters for countries of origin that people are leaving. How do we think about return migrants as an asset, bringing skills back? And a lot of people have returned to their countries of origin during the pandemic. So how do you think of making sure those people are included in financial institutions? How do you take advantage of the skills they've gained abroad? How do you take advantage of the assets, the financial assets they've gained abroad, money they bring back, and make sure that can be banked because they have financial access? And how do you take advantage of remittances? Many people abroad would love to invest in their country of origin, and particularly into family businesses, but it's often hard to do. And it's actually a wasted asset. How can we think about in countries of origin that have large diasporas abroad in helping create access to credit backed by remittances as a way of actually increasing the investment in countries that desperately need it, particularly at a time when we're trying to pull out of a global recession? So a few ideas to put on the table. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn this over to Carmella Gadu.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrew. Do you hear me? I don't see myself. Yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for setting the scene so well. Your ideas are, I'm fully in agreement with your points. But turning to this part of the world, in 2015, the impact of violent conflict, particularly in Syria and Iraq, has resulted in humanitarian crisis and mass displacement in the context of what the European Union defines as the Southern Mediterranean neighborhood, with spillover effects throughout the region. 2015 will remain in history as the Mediterranean migration crisis, which saw over 1 million refugees and migrants fleeing conflict and struggling economies, and resulted in many European countries introducing a series of stricter and harsher entry conditions for those who were seeking to migrate, but also culminated in a global recognition of the migration and development nexus by the United Nations, with the endorsement of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals for the first time in history, which refers to orderly, safe, and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. In September 2016, the UN Secretary General called member states to a summit on refugees and migrants, which culminated in the New York Declaration and launched 2 separate compacts, one on safe, orderly, and regular migration, and the other dedicated to refugees. The first ever international negotiated document, the Global Compact on Migration, provides a pathway to interlink migration to be part of a broader development and mobility cooperation agenda, although this is not a binding instrument. It is based on existing international laws and treaties. The Mediterranean events in 2015 prompted the reforms of perhaps broadest ranging impact in the EU, such as the overhaul of the Dublin III regulations and the strengthening and expansion of Frontex, the EU Border and Coast Agency. The Dublin regulation looks at the Asylum law in Europe into a full-fledged actor. The EU Border and Coast Agency was standing the full-fledged actor of returns in the EU and beyond. On the external front, the new agenda on migration, the partnership framework, and the Valletta Plan of Action were drawn up in years that followed. And building on these developments and following the European elections of 2019, the EU is now seeking yet another overhaul, a fresh start, if you want, with the new Pact on Migration and Asylum unveiled last September. The migration remains deeply divisive among the European Union member states, and enforcing returns is one of the few unifying topics. EU overall focus has moved to prevention, reduction of flows and return, while the lesson learned show that no meaningful discussion on return cooperation can take place without viable legal pathway on offer. Both the Americas and the EU and the Mediterranean corridor are faced with a similar dynamic of large mixed flows, the flows that Andrew was talking about. The common denominator here is the nature of mixed and irregular arrivals and the response on both continents, the Americas and the EU, in conflating refugees and migrant response. However, the response, reception, and assistance from member states must fall along the separate lines of asylum and migrants without any prejudice to the universal applicability of fundamental human rights, meaning all asylum seekers must enjoy their inalienable right to due process and individual assessment, despite and even if the numbers are overwhelming and mixed with other irregular migrants. The response to the overwhelming numbers is not in narrowing or strengthening or suspending the asylum procedures, but offering additional regular migration pathway or making viable the existing ones. The EU has made decisive and comprehensive efforts to move its migration and border management as far from its borders as possible or feasible. From the EU-Turkey statement to joint way forward with Afghanistan to the Valletta plan to enhancing the mandates of its agencies into third countries, the common denominator is EU seeking the support of its partner countries to manage its migration. EU member states and institutions have substantially increased their early warning surveillance and data collection capacity. Investments have also been made in Europe neighborhood partners in southern Mediterranean to try to improve border management. At the same time, some EU member states have significantly increased their intake of refugees through resettlement channels, complementary pathway and family reunification, but the intra-EU solidarity measures have had limited success. The EU has also made the prospect of pathway of regular migration and development aid a bargaining chip in exchange for tightened border control in key third countries, especially in MENA and Africa. Nothing wrong with this. However, measures taken by states to stiffen controls along land and sea migratory routes are believed to have ambivalent effects on irregular migration, reducing the number of migrants while increasing the risks migrants are exposed to as they take more dangerous roads to bypass the obstacles. Southern Mediterranean countries in North Africa and the Near East have adopted a variety of responses. Morocco issued a new migration governance law. Tunisia worked on tightening border controls and search and rescue. In Libya, we have seen an increase in pushbacks of irregular migrants amidst COVID-19 challenges, internal strife, and lack of territory control. The European Union Emergency Trust Fund for Stability and Addressing Root Causes of Irregular Migration and Displaced Persons in Africa, the so-called Eupf for Africa, was established in the aftermath of the 2015 crisis and sets 4 objectives: creating employment opportunities, strengthening resilience of communities, improving migration management, and improving governance and conflict prevention. The EUTF objectives are all commendable, but addressing irregular migration needs to be accompanied by opening pathway for regular migration. In December 2016, IOM launched, with the support of the Trust Fund, the EU Trust Fund for Africa, the EU IOM Joint Initiative, an innovative and comprehensive program that contributes to facilitating orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration management through the development of implementation of right-based, development-based, dignified return and sustainable reintegration policies. In the aftermath of the 2015 crisis, the African and European governments share a common vision of irregular migration as a crime, and they effectively cooperate to contain undocumented migrants and deport those apprehended in irregular situation. Vulnerable and stranded migrants will continue to need protection and life-saving assistance along the migration route in Africa, particularly in Libya, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and most recently on the Western Mediterranean route from Western Africa to the Canary Islands. As a spiral is triggered by which smugglers' strategies to get around states' control put the safety of migrants at increasing risk. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought additional challenges from migrants and the people on the move. An increase in irregular migrant flows and smuggling operations is expected along the African continent main migration corridors once the COVID-19 related mobility restrictions are lifted. A combination of factors, including the socio-economic impact of COVID-19, political discontent, and social tensions in some countries, for example, Ethiopia, Sudan, Côte d'Ivoire, could drive more people to migrate. We at IOM are now trying to move the migration to be part of a broader development and mobility cooperation agenda where states mutually benefit through our current work in international human mobility governance as coordinator and secretariat of the UN Migration Network to support countries in the implementation of the GCM. And this is all from me, and I pass the floor now to Andrew Reynolds. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Carmella, who's from our sister UN agency. UNHCR and IOM work very closely together all around the world, and it's a very productive and positive relationship, so thanks. And I'd like to thank the Baker Institute at Rice University for including UNHCR in this timely discussion, and I appreciate the comments of the other panelists. Look, it's an interesting sign of the times. A decade ago, we were closing down programs and offices in Central America. The emergency refugee crises were over in the region, and the UN was actually focusing on development issues, which are managed by other UN agencies. We consolidated operations into one regional office in Panama. Today, we're undergoing a major expansion again with large standalone country operations and programs in Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Costa Rica. Much of the buildup and new program activity is actually thanks to the very generous and robust support from the US government, which is our '1 donor, both regionally and globally. So a special thank you to the US Department of State and to the American people for this support. As in the Mediterranean and in Venezuela, Central America is a mixed flow, as described, a more complex and politically complicated situation than, say, the more traditional refugee flight that you're familiar with, Rohingya in Bangladesh, or Syrians fleeing to Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Remember too that UNHCR's mandate and operational focus is on forced displacement, which can be a significant element of a mixed flow. And these are the people that really are being forced out and require special attention and special international protection. And displacement is very much on the rise in Central America in 2020. At mid-year, UNHCR recorded around 1 million total displaced from the 3 North Central American countries and Nicaragua. NCA movement, the movement in NCA is movement north as to Mexico and to the US border. And Nicaragua is mostly to Costa Rica, but with COVID and border closures and capacity issues on the southern route, Nicaraguans are now heading north in greater numbers. We're also seeing increasing displacement from certain parts of Mexico, where there are tensions between law enforcement and the cartels. There's an increasing number of IDPs, internally displaced persons, in the NCA countries, as many first try to find safety in their own country before later fleeing north across international borders. You know, to be forcibly displaced, flight is a last resort. It is not a voluntary option. No one chooses to be a refugee, and no one wants to have to seek asylum. So much of the UNHCR programming and operations in the NCA countries is to try to help stabilize populations at home and help the IDPs, and again, with significant support from the US government. Because most importantly, the flight north is very dangerous, very exploitative. And again, these are individuals who would rather not leave home in the first place. Now, COVID-19 has only exacerbated existing drivers of displacement in the region. You know, there are the original underlying root causes that are forcing flight. Gang violence in all forms, not just homicide rates. That's an interesting factor people use, but extortion and kidnappings and sex trade and all kinds of gang violence and gang activity, poor governance and social support systems, weak law enforcement and judicial systems, discrimination, and struggling economies, among others. So now add COVID with all of its health and economic costs. And just as little spotlights of things that are happening because of it, we see heightened incidents of domestic violence during lockdowns, particularly in Guatemala. We're seeing a rise of political repression in countries like Nicaragua and Honduras. And we're definitely seeing increased gang and cartel violence, taking advantage of COVID-19 in El Salvador, Honduras, and parts of Mexico. The numbers tell the story. In Mexico, the number of monthly apprehensions, which is about 8,000 a month, and asylum receipts, which was about 4,000 a month, have both returned to pre-COVID levels, despite continued movement restrictions across the region. And as part of that process, we UNHCR and the UN is very involved with helping strengthen, build, and work Mexico's asylum system. The numbers are also climbing at the US border, I think, as Andrew alluded to, at the US southern border, some 69,000 just in October of 2020, which is a very high for October. Although we know that CPB border statistics are inflated due to Title 42, that's the emergency COVID public health expulsions, and probably repeat crossings. The situation may grow worse in the coming months. Currently, COVID-19 plus the US elections, plus the hurricanes, which none of us really put into a big planning perspective, create, if you will, the perfect storm. And we predict UNHCR that we will see much further displacement from this region in the coming months as a result of the combination of all these new significant push and pull factors. Now, UNHCR has been on the forefront of the public health response to COVID and the humanitarian response to the hurricanes. Our motto through this crisis has been to stay and deliver, and now it's really more of just a duty to serve because we are staying and delivering. And while these crises are not directly within the UNHCR mandate as you know it, thinking about protection, we have been able to leverage our wide footprint in the region to provide life-saving support. Also, refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs are among the most vulnerable in these countries that are directly affected by these public health and climate events. And as is occurring globally, the health pandemic is now fueling a pandemic of poverty in these vulnerable communities. I just wanted to finish here with a quick top line issue about the hurricanes, because as I mentioned, it's something that's a real factor that I think when we were all discussing about the panel, even a couple of weeks ago, we're not really putting this in. And I want to talk about shelter numbers because I think they're very relevant because they are an indicator of future migration. Honduras is a country most impacted by ETA in the region with an estimated 0.8 million affected, and that includes 60,000 in shelters. Guatemala has about 370,000 affected with 16,000 in shelters. Southern Mexico, that's Chiapas, Tabasco, and Veracruz, about 169,000 affected with 17,000 in shelters. Nicaragua, 150,000 affected with 50,000 in shelters. And even Panama, which has probably doesn't come into the equations office with 3,800 affected and 2,500 in shelters. Now add iota, which is likely to even be far more destructive given its strength, its size, and how closely it's coming on the destruction from ETA. As you may figure, just for the UN response, OCHA is leading the international humanitarian response within the UN system, but the movements are happening. Humanitarian country teams have been established at the local, at the national levels. We lead the protection and shelter clusters, and various other UN agencies are very much involved, WFP, IOM, UNICEF, to name a few. So there's a lot of close coordination with national authorities in the country. We're hoping to stabilize populations, but again, the danger is out there. For those of you interested, the US government response is the lead is USAID, the new Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs. There are a number of protection concerns that are growing because of the hurricanes. They include access to shelter, and shelter capacity is a very major challenge, particularly in Honduras. We've provided these additional refugee housing units. They're kind of IKEA put together housing units to supplement the shelter capacity. But again, it's not enough. Public health, obviously the hurricanes are aggravating already a dire public health situation. And then we've also seen, as what happens when you are moving and there's so many in overcrowded emergency shelters, there's a lot of growing SGBV and other forms of violence. So the bottom line is, look, 2020 has been a mess, okay, in many, many ways. And its impact in 2021 on all countries in the region, including the United States, with the movement of people, both forced and voluntary, will certainly be profound and something that I know that we'll want to continue discussing. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Matthew. I think we can kind of bring everybody up now, and we can start the Q&A. So Carmella and Andrew, if you want to join us. Thank you. And again, folks, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat box, and we will try to get to them. But I actually wanted to pick up on what you closed with, Matthew, and this was the impact of the hurricanes. And I think one thing that I'm pretty sure we didn't talk about in the context as we were discussing the panel, and none of us delved into too deeply, was the impact of climate change on future migration. And in fact, I think it was this week or last week, the New York Times did a deep dive on how a Biden administration was thinking of setting up their Department of Homeland Security. And they were actually going to start to integrate climate change data into kind of how they are planning out and thinking about managing migration. So from your three perspectives, what will the impact be of climate change on migration? That's probably an easy one. But from a policy perspective, what are the things we should be thinking about? And again, we have so many different regions and perspectives represented here. So let me throw that. Carmella, do you mind if we start with you there?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andrea. Actually, the climate change is already provoking movement of people. And given the trend, we can see climate change influencing more and more the life of people, especially in this continent, with drought, we have seen several countries in Africa on the brink of famine. And there are some countries that are already confronted with the large movement of people. Well, if you think of for example, small islands in the ocean, and the question of how we are going to relocate these people. I mean, they're losing their land. They're pushed away because they will not have land. So it is something that we have to look at. And of course, we are looking at IOM, we are looking at migration and climate change from a policy perspective, and looking at discussing with member states on how to address what is already happening, and we're discussing on policies that will look at livelihood, will look at human rights also, the fundamental human rights of these forced migrants. Thank you.
Andrew, you want to take this one?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things, I mean, there's several things here that we should be looking at. One is, to the extent that we know that things are getting worse and we can begin to identify where they're getting worse, we can actually begin to plan. And most of the dislocation is not international migration, it's internal migration, right? I mean, this is people leaving where they live, coastal areas, farmlands, and headed to cities. And so there's a real incentive to try and do this within countries, because most of that migration is going to happen within countries as well as across country borders. One of the things that we need to do, and we really need a marriage here of scientists, of climate scientists with people who follow migration. We tend to assume that every climate event is climate change, which is clearly not the case. But what we do know is that climate events are getting worse lots of places, right? We can see this in the Caribbean, in Central America, in parts of Southeast Asia, in the Pacific. I mean, we see this all over the world. And so beginning to actually know, while we can see this happening in real time, really begin to do the diagnosis and know how it's happening actually. And then we can start to talk about what measures need to be put in place to protect people, right? To both help people within countries so that there's some managed transition, and then figure out what the international component is here. We don't want to get to the point where, and I'm sure Matthew will say this, where everyone becomes we create a category of climate migration and sort of everyone becomes a climate refugee, and we sort of extend the categories we already have. What we want to do is manage this so that people have real alternatives as things get worse. And we need to factor this into our understanding, right? I mean, understanding of when we think about a place like Central America, for example, the reasons people move are complex. That mixed migration that Matthew was talking about is, it's a mixture. It's mostly economic and protection, sort of the ends, but it's really more complicated, right? It's not really a line. It's more of a diagram, a three-dimensional diagram in which climate is another part, or, climate conditions affected by climate change is another pole on that as well. Economics certainly are, which are tied to that, but are have its own dynamic. Violence is another piece of that, public security, and there are a few other dimensions that people have. And we need to actually think about all those dimensions and how they interact at the same time in people's lived lives.
Matthew.
Yes, I would point out that climate change, per large, as well as the more localized natural disasters, we consider them, just to address sort of the climate refugee factor, we're very legal about our mandate and the 1951 Refugee Act, conventions, but it's clear they are clearly multiplier factors in forced displacement, without a question. I mean, if you look at competition for land after a disaster or due to droughts and other climate change activities, can lead to additional violence, discrimination, persecution, civil war, and that leads to forced displacement, i.e. refugees. So it overlaps in a way that is a multiplying factor that makes it even more urgent to look at this, because we already have enough factors of long-term unsolved political crises that have created refugees. We should be trying to find solutions, not add more multiplier factors.
Thank you. So one theme that kind of came out in your comments was decisions by whether it's the US or the EU to, in essence, push migration decision points further away from whether it's the US border or EU border. So in the US, those are the safe third country agreements with a number of the Central American countries, excuse me. Carmella, you talked about kind of the things that are being done in Northern Africa. What Well, I guess one very specific question in terms of the U.S. is, what do you think is going to happen with the third safe country agreements? Sorry, that the Trump administration put into place. But then, how does the Biden administration's decisions in this space impact the way that the EU is starting to think about these things, or is there any impact at all? Are they just very, very different realities? Awkward
Well, I
side.
can jump in pretty quickly because I'll take the UN diplomatic route here. We're not really, we work with all of our major governments, and particularly in the United States, and we've shared a lot of back and forth with the Trump administration, as we had before with Obama and others when there are issues regarding international standards and refugees. I'll make it very clear, UNHCR was not the ACAs, these agreements, these third safe countries agreements do not meet our standards. We were not a party to any of this. These are bilateral discussions. And I'll take off my UNHCR hat here and speak as an American national form of government. I am sure it's something that's on, it is being considered by the Biden transition people as to what they're going to do about them in the future. But we stand readily available to work with US administrations on finding really proper durable solutions and finding ways that the US can remain and be even a better leader in the refugee and asylum space globally.
Yeah, this is an issue. I actually have an article out in America's Quarterly today that looks at this, and we have a report coming out on Friday or Monday that will go into some more depth, which is, I would say, the ACAs, I'll agree with Matthew on this, the ACAs and the Migration Protection Protocol really don't meet international standards for access to protection, right? They just are, sending someone through Guatemala's asylum system as an alternative to the US, where that asylum system is weak and also the surrounding context for protection in the country is very weak, or sending someone to wait out of the country where it's hard to even maintain contact with them in an environment that's often dangerous, just don't meet minimum standards for humanitarian protection. And I think a new administration is going to look at askance at these and look at how they wind them down, possibly quite early. That said, humanitarian protection is complicated, and it's complicated by the fact that we don't have labor pathways, and therefore humanitarian protection often becomes the default that people use, right? And unless you open up those labor pathways, which in the US terms is seasonal worker visas, people have huge incentives to use the asylum system as an alternative. So we have to fix the asylum system so it can't be used that way, and it's better and more fair for people who really need it. But secondly, though, I would, I'm against extraterritorializing protection and asylum and saying people have to go through filters in another place before they get to the border. There's a reason why we have asylum at our borders. It is part of international law. It's part of agreements we've signed. It's part of our national laws, as it is in the United States. That is, but that should be thought of as a default, as a last resort for protection. And it's become the first and only resort we have in many cases, particularly for the United States in Central America. And so there is a reason to think about of pushing borders back and pushing protection closer to where people are without getting rid of asylum, not as an alternative to asylum, not getting rid of asylum and saying, we're going to do this where you live, but in addition to, and as a first line of defense, right? I mean, so we could be, so just ideas. We have something called the Protection Transfer Agreement, which is UNHCR and IOM involved in, through Costa Rica, where we take a few hundred people every year who are in danger in Central America, relocate them into Costa Rica, and then eventually several countries, including the United States, but also Canada and Australia and Brazil and Uruguay, take part in resettling people to another country, right? If they meet the criteria to go through their refugee program. We have done some things on a very small scale with the Mexican government, people who are in the Mexican asylum system who might be better served leaving the country and have been taken either by the United States or another country on a case-by-case basis, often mediated by UNHCR. These are the kind of things we should be able to scale up, at least modestly, right? I mean, how do we identify people closer to home who are in danger, get them out of harm's way, and get them to. Now, that's not going to work for the mass number of people, but it works for some people who are particularly vulnerable, who can be identified. We had something called the Central American Minors Program, which ran during the end of the Obama administration. It's worth looking at again if we could restart it. Again, it's not a solution for massive numbers of people, but it's a good solution for a small number of unaccompanied minors who are particularly vulnerable and have protection needs that might or might not meet the asylum bar. And we should be thinking about protection systems in countries. And this is true of Central America, but it's also true many other places around the world, which is, a country like Mexico. Mexico is actually working on an internally displaced people's law right now, internally displaced persons law. It just passed the House of Representatives. It's now in the Mexican Senate. It was sent by the López Obrador administration, which seeks to give protection to people within their own country and give them a recognition that they've been displaced and give them some access to protection from the Mexican government. They also have a mechanism for human rights defenders and for journalists. How do you plus those things up? How do you in El Salvador? El Salvador has a program which is being debated in the assembly that hasn't been approved, also to protect human rights defenders and journalists. You have great NGOs like Cristosal in El Salvador and Honduras, who have simply, and some of the NGOs, Ali, in Honduras, who have done work on the ground simply on their own, trying to protect people who don't want to leave the country, who want to stay in the country, who are on that limit where they might be able, with the right set of support network, and hopefully a little bit of muscle from the government, but certainly from an NGO, can find a safe space within their own country so they don't have to migrate. So we should have asylum, we should have a good asylum system at our borders, but we should also be investing in these opportunities for protection closer to home, because it's the right thing to do. And by the way, it will also help people not make a 2,000-mile journey or a 5,000-mile journey to across the Mediterranean or up to the US-Mexico border. It also helps with migration management, but it's also the right thing to do for protection.
If I can add from a different perspective, in the Mediterranean, it's a bit different. We have the European Union, where legal pathway for migration are responsibility of member states, while asylum is responsibility of the Union. And I think that the problem here is exactly this one, the fact that we have mixed migration flows where asylum seekers are traveling together with migrants that are looking for better opportunities. And we should not separate them. I mean, I don't think that we should separate these groups, but we should understand that there are different, why the migrants that are looking for better opportunities or that have a job in the European countries, they have to go on this boat, and why they cannot apply for a temporary or migration visa. We know that there are hundreds of thousands of irregular migrants in Europe, in many European countries. And I'm not talking only about Italy, that is my country, but in France, in Spain, that are working, but they don't have a legal status because they cannot apply for a work visa. Now, individual states have arranged for readmission agreements with the Northern African countries and other countries of the neighborhood environment in exchange of support and more development funds, but now the new migration pact, for example, where the issue of asylum and migration is conflated in one unique. I mean, it's the only way for a migrant to migrate regularly or to migrate to Kur is to embark on irregular trips across the Mediterranean. So while there are legal pathways which are not promoted, and there could be more because people, as I think Andrew was saying in setting the scene, the number of migrants is not overwhelming. especially the number of migrants from Africa are a very small number. Those that travel outside Africa, there is a much bigger movement, migration movement inside Africa. But those that are willing to cross the Mediterranean, they have to do it irregularly because there are no legal pathway. And this way, they create bottlenecks in the asylum processes, where you have on the Greek islands thousands and thousands of asylum seekers stuck on the islands waiting for their due process for months and years. So I think that something should be done and can be done in this sense.
So, I mean, first of all, thank you. I think already in just a very short conversation, we've begun to see what the similarities are between the two regions' respective migration flows, but also some real challenges and differences. So, oftentimes, you know, these conversations, they can just end up being very, very depressing and sad and difficult conversations. So, I want to end on a high note here. So, my question for you, just in the last few minutes we have together, is what gives you hope? What gives you hope about the future?
I think there's been a shift, you know, in the United States where I spend most of my time. I think there's been a shift. We've seen it in public opinion to people being much more positive about migration. They're not uncritical. People want to see migration go through legal channels. I think it's incumbent on us to think about how we create those legal channels, right? I think that is, you know, I think people want to see that there's a rule of law-based system here, and we should actually be focused on that, on how we create those conditions that allow at least some people who otherwise might migrate illegally to go through legal-based channels. I mean, you know, and I think that's an opportunity. It's not going to work fully, but that is a huge opportunity. And people are sympathetic. People are sympathetic to the refugee program in the United States. They're sympathetic to protection overall. They don't understand asylum necessarily. I mean, that's never been a public discussion in the same way. But to refugees, the notion of protection, people are very sympathetic. The other part of the world where I've spent a lot of time recently is virtually more than physically in the past, you know, 9 or 10 months, of course, but still virtually there all the time, and physically a lot over the past few years is in South America and Costa Rica. And there you've seen, you know, countries that did not have a lot of experience with migration deal with a massive flow of, you know, around 5 million Venezuelans. It's close now to 5 million who settled just in Latin America, actually, mostly in South America, Costa Rica, and about 100,000, you know, over 100,000 Nicaraguans, a recent flow into Costa Rica, and have done it with relatively little fuss. Not to say there's no pushback and not to say there's no questions, but have generally decided that solidarity outweighs, and the fact that, you know, solidarity with people who are living through real crises outweighs whatever other concerns they have. We just saw the Peruvian government do another legalization program in the middle of COVID for Venezuelan migrants. It's less generous than earlier ones, but the fact that they're doing it at all, I mean, you know, my colleagues in Peru say, but it's not as good as the other ones. And my response is, but no one else is doing this. I mean, this is in the middle of COVID. It's actually kind of impressive that it's still happening with all the faults that it may have, right? I mean, and Costa Rica last week just did a regularization program for Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and Cubans who were denied asylum, which basically means if you are Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, or Cuban and you're in Costa Rica, you apply for asylum. If you don't get asylum, you can apply for complementary protection. So this is, as they're calling it. So I mean, this is amazing. This is not to say that Latin America is a utopia of migration policy. There's lots of pushback. Things are getting more negative, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. But overall, compared to the rest of the world, we've seen the good side of human nature come out in being able to receive people and recognize that they too, these are all countries that have had out migration in other moments, and that these people are very much like their own relatives and friends and neighbors who at a different time left and went somewhere else. And that's, I think that's a lesson for the world that we should take away.
Matthew, Carmella, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add, the pandemic has brought us very bad things. has increased the hate speech and anti-migrant sentiment in many countries, but it has also brought some positive developments. You were talking about the regularization. We have seen some countries, even in this region, and I say even in this region because for example, in my region, I have the Gulf countries where some of these Gulf countries have been regularly criticized for their labor regimes. But even in these countries, there has been some regularization. But in Europe, we have seen recognizing publicly the value of the migrants' contribution in Europe. Many have received regularization because they've been involved, for example, in the response to the health pandemic, to the health crisis. So yeah, let's look at the half part of the glass.
The glass half full.
Yeah.
Matthew, to close us out, please.
Sure, thanks. I guess I'd point out to two quick things. One is actually much more, if you will, hopeful, practical soon. And that is, as Andrew and Carmella both referred to, is finding these alternative legal pathways. And we can all be quite innovative. We're not living in the 1700s here, okay? So we can find ways to find durable solutions for people, whether they be only temporary till they can return home for certain refugees, or maybe for a longer term aspect as well. I mean, look, just before COVID happened, as part of the Global Compact on Refugees, we've built a strong relationship with the World Bank, which is allowing World Bank development funds, which is encouraging countries that are hosting refugees, and around the world, 85% of them are in developed or developing or mid-developed countries right across the border, to actually, if you include refugees in your national and local development plans, there is a grants of additional funds from the World Bank that would obviously help your local communities very greatly. So a refugee is not seen as someone taking away, but actually bringing more from an international scene. That's just one innovative way to provide some sort of durable solution for some of those refugees. I think maybe on the more, I don't know, pie in the sky kind of hope for the future is we've seen globally, not just with the United States, but others, sort of more of a nativism and a retreat inside the borders with less engagement and less sort of concept of we're all in this together, and we need to find solutions. So I'm hopeful that we'll maybe have more international engagement and maybe a little pendulum swing back that will allow us first to stop the new things from happening. I mean, look, we just have a new major outflow of refugees from Ethiopia because of the issues in Tigray. You now have northern Mozambique creating a no. So the first thing is, with that kind of maybe global leadership, it's the EU, the US, the UN, all sorts, to really help contain and stop and prevent those kinds of things first, and then have that opportunity to take on, really to tackle the really long, protracted, particularly refugee crises around the world, some of which have been going on for decades, like Afghanistan and Syria now, and others. So call me a little bit optimistic, but it's always better to look up than look down.
Hey, well, I want to thank our panelists, Andrew Seeley from MPI, Carmella Gadu from IOM, and then Matthew Reynolds with UNHCR. Really want to thank Kelsey Norman and the team at the Baker Institute and the, the Center for the Middle East and the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University. So thank you very much for joining. Thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.